We have an update regarding the Grand Forks SWAT team being called into the south side of Crookston on Sunday evening to help with an arrest. 44-year-old Frank Malone Williams Jr. has now been charged in the case. He's facing two felonies: assault in the second degree and false imprisonment, intentional restraint. Now, here's what happened according to the criminal complaint. Quote, a Crookston police officer was dispatched to a domestic assault call at the emergency room at Riverview Hospital in Crookston. The reporting party said Jane Doe had been beat up pretty bad. The reporting party said she heard messages where Jane Doe told the defendant to put the gun away. The defendant was identified as the person responsible for the domestic assault, which is Frank Williams Jr., shown here. The officer went to the ER and spoke with Jane Doe. Jane Doe told the officer the following. She and the defendant had been arguing. She went to the defendant's house. She tried to leave. The defendant grabbed her by the neck. He threw her against the door frame. She hit her side of the face against the door frame. The defendant grabbed her with both hands. She felt like she was going to black out. She felt dizzy. She had a headache. Her neck was stiff. It occurred at the back door of the defendant's house. Before the defendant grabbed her, he threw his phone at her. The phone hit her in the right arm shoulder area. The defendant picked up the phone and slapped her in the face with it. The defendant was trying to get her to talk to someone on the phone. The defendant had a gun today, and the defendant pointed the gun at her and made threats at least 2 times in the past. Jane Doe appeared very emotional and broke down crying. The officer saw swelling and a bruise on Jane Doe's face. He took a picture of the bruise and swelling. Jane Doe explained the defendant threatened to kill her and shoot himself if she went to the cops. Jane Doe described a handgun and said the defendant always carries a gun. He usually carries the gun in his pants pocket. Today, he pulled it from the couch area. The defendant had the gun with him, but he had not pointed at her. In the past, he held the gun to her head. She was afraid of what would happen if she pressed charges. She was afraid the defendant would get out and get her. The defendant would not let her leave the house. After the assault, the defendant tried to hug her. The defendant prevented her from leaving the house. It lasted for about an hour. The defendant blocked the door. She convinced the defendant to let her go to the hospital and come right back. She told the defendant she would not call the cops. The defendant told her she could not leave. The defendant took her phone. The defendant later gave her her phone back. The defendant gave her some ice to her face. She was finally able to leave. She drove herself to the hospital, and she was afraid the defendant was going to kill her. Jane Doe said the defendant has a lot of guns, and he likes guns. She said the defendant threatened to shoot and kill police officers if they came to his house. That's when the Grand Forks SWAT team was called in. Back to the criminal complaint. The SWAT team executed a search warrant at the defendant's home and recovered a Glock 43 handgun and an AR-15 style assault rifle. In the defendant's son's bedroom, police officers found a Glock 43X pistol and a ghost gun. The ghost gun did not have a serial number. There were loaded magazines throughout the house. The magazines were for pistols and the AR-style rifle. The defendant was present at the execution of the search warrant and taken into custody. He was transported to the Northwest Regional Correctional Center, the jail in Crookston. On Monday, the defendant was interviewed by a detective who advised him of his Miranda warning, and Williams agreed to give a statement. In his statement, the defendant denied assaulting Jane Doe. He told the detective they were on and off for 7 years. They had been dating for the last 3 years. The defendant admitted there were trust issues in the relationship. The defendant said they had been arguing, and he told Jane Doe to leave. The defendant was emotional and crying. He did admit he gave Jane Doe a bear hug. He told her he loved her, and he said Jane Doe was very emotional and out of control. The defendant said he did not do anything. He denied saying he would shoot the cops if they came to his house. He feels like Jane Doe is setting him up. The defendant admitted he had a security system, but it does not record. The security system is a live feed only. Unquote. That was from the criminal complaint. Again, Frank Malone Williams Jr., charged with felonies of assault in the second degree and false imprisonment, intentional restraint. On this late Tuesday afternoon, he remains in jail on a cash bail of $20,000. I'm Neil Carlson reporting for iNewZ.TV.